guys, this is Wojtek, and today we're going to take a look at how using Blender we can convert our kick animations so they look a little bit better. Specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to create a root bone for our 3D character using Blender, which is a free tool competitor to Maya and 3ds Max that you can just grab, and it will allow us to do these manipulations. We're then going to take our animation, our roundhouse animation, and introduce root motion by creating proper transition states for our root bone. And then lastly, we're also going to look at, hey, how can we convert this animation so it doesn't use root motion, but rather stays in place, so it doesn't slide forwards and a bit to the right the way we're seeing it now. So, let's get started. Alright guys, so let's start taking a look at how to configure our animations so they just work a little bit better, either by using root motion or adding in root bones to our characters, or by doing in-place animations. And we'll look at that in a second of how we do all of that in Blender, but first let's look at the problem. So over the last little bit we've been creating these animations, and our punches are kind of cool and they work well, but then let's look at our kicks. So that one's not bad. It's in place, the character doesn't go very far. But this one, that roundhouse, you'll notice when we trigger that one, which is, it's all random, but when we trigger that roundhouse, he moves forward and then back. And let me just show you real quick why that's happening. So if we go back to our blueprint for our player character, and we go to the capsule component, and we set the visibility to, not visibility, hidden in game. So that means the capsule will not be visible while the game is running. But here we can see the problem. So not bad, he stays within the capsule, and then let's see if we can, there we go. So you can see with the roundhouse, he slides out of the capsule and then back into it. And we have a couple of ways that we can deal with this. So what we can do is we can introduce root motion, which will force the capsule to move with the animation. So when he does that, the capsule should slide kind of a bit this way towards the right. Or we have the option of taking this animation, which slides out of the capsule, and keep it in place. And that way it remains static and it's in line with our capsule. And then if we want to actually show movement during that animation cycle, we can do that through blueprints or code and just have the capsule slide along with it. So we have a couple of options, and let me show you real quick how we can enable both of them. Alright guys, so let's go into Blender, and I'm using version 279, but this technique is going to apply to, I'm hoping, any other versions of Blender, as well as Maya, 3ds Max, and any other 3D tooling you may be leveraging for this exercise. But let's look at Blender, and one thing we're going to do real quick is just clean up our startup scene, because it comes with, it's got a camera, and it's got this little box, and whatever that is. But we don't want all this stuff. So let's click on the box and delete it. We'll leave the camera in place for now, but we're going to make a slight adjustment to our scene presentation as well. So if you click the scene tab, what we're going to do is we're going to change the length to use metric as its measuring system, and we're going to change the unit scale from 1 to 0.01. And what this really means is we're resetting the view such that our scene and our world within Blender matches the scene and world within Unreal a little bit better. So when we bring in our models, there's not going to be any weird sort of scaling or weird behaviors. The reason the grid is also stretched out is because I'm not adjusting any of the sort of the zooming on the camera and things like that, but that's okay. So with our scene configured, what we can do is we can say File, Save Startup File, and this will retain these settings every time we load a new version of a Blender scene. So if you say File New, reload Startup File, boom, we're back to where we started. Cool. So let's go ahead and create our root bone definition for our T 3D model pose. To do so, we go to File, Import, FBX, and then we navigate to our tutorial directory, and you'll notice I already have one here that I was experimenting with earlier, but we're going to go do it from scratch by selecting the Kachujin G. Rosales T-pose, which we downloaded from Mixamo, and either double-clicking or clicking the Import FBX button in the top right-hand corner. But there she is, and there's all her bone definitions. Cool. So all we're going to do with this T-pose is basically rename the armature component to root. So to do so, you click the armature setting, which if you expand it out in the scene preview window there, contains the pose, the animations, the various bone definitions, and all that good stuff. And we'll deal with this in a second. But let's select this guy and then navigate to the object details, and we're going to rename it from armature to root. Cool. So that saves the root component with the name of root, and now when we import it into Unreal, you'll notice you'll get recognized almost automatically. So we're done with this guy. Let's go to File, Export, FBX. And one thing you need to worry about when you're exporting your FBX files is the orientation, so the forward, because again, to match it to the world space of Unreal, you want to set it to -y forward with the Z being up. Z, Z. Now, if we go back to our project, we're just going to save this as the root T pose. Alright, cool. So we're done with this part of the tutorial. Now let's go back to Unreal. So with Unreal open, we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this Mixamo Import, just to not clutter the rest of our files. And then we're going to take in our root T-pose, and we're just going to drag it right in. So on the import window, you basically want to leave everything default, so we want to bring in the skeletal mesh, the import mesh. We want to leave the skeleton that it assigns it to as empty because we want Unreal to create a net new one, and disregard anything around the transforms and the animations because we're not doing any of that right now. So import. And when you get this warning, disregard it again. What it means is, hey, the thing we're bringing in has more definitions than the thing I know about, which is the Unreal Mannequin. So, deal with it. And we will. So we don't have to worry about this too much. Now, with our character brought in, what we can do is we can open up the skeleton and now start hooking it up to a rig and retarget the actual skeleton definitions. But before we do that, let's just take a look at our skeleton tree. You'll notice our root bone, which is sort of in the center of the character, right by the floor, is called root, and that's because we brought it in from our Blender exported FBX file. Cool. So, Retargeting Manager. There's a separate tutorial in my set of videos that goes over this, specifically around the Mixamo animations, but you can apply this technique again to anything. And we're just going to kind of quickly skim through this. So we're going to select our rig, which is humanoid. And then, because we're, good scientists and we save things, we're going to click load, and we're going to pull up this Mixamo rig mapping container, which was already done in one of our previous tutorials, with the only adjustment is going to be to our root definition. Rather than hips, which is what we were doing before, we're going to set this to be root. Cool. So there's our guy, and he's remapped. And now we can bind animations towards this character model and then re-import them for our Unreal Mannequin. The only other thing we're going to do is we're going to click this button here that says Apply to Asset. And what it's going to do is it's going to apply this pose to our preview windows whenever we do re-importing of animations from this guy to our Unreal Mannequin. And again, this is covered in our Mixamo importing video. Cool. So we're done with this guy. Let's just save him. And there we go. So now that we have this saved, let's go ahead and convert our animations to reference this, this mannequin. So to do so, we're going to go back to Blender. And I'm just going to create a new scene. So File New. And it's going to clean up all this stuff for me. Then I'm going to say File Import, FBX. And I'm going to find my medium right roundhouse FBX. So there's our animation in all of its skeletal glory. And when we play it back using the timeline here, you'll notice there's our kick. And there's the character kind of sliding off to the right. Okay, so this is now where it gets a little funky. What we're going to do is we're going to start creating bones, or rather a bone, for our character that is going to become our root bone definition. And to do so, we're going to go to our armature or our bone definition. And don't worry about the names. You'll see how this all plays out in a second. And what we're going to do is we're going to hit space, and we're going to say add bone. And there's our bone. Now, you'll notice it's sort of in the center of the feet, which is more or less where we want it to be. We basically want it at position 0, 0. But there's our bone. And, you know, we got the transform gizmo, so we can kind of move it around and do stuff with it. But we really want it at 0, 0. So I'm going to change the translate to 0, 0 and just leave it there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick my hip bones, again here on the right hand side, or you can select it from this view here. And if you can't get to this view and it's kind of looking like that, well, that's the trick. Change from pose view to edit mode, and you'll get back to this view. So we're going to select our root bone, and we're going to shift click on our hip bone, so both of them are selected. And then we're going to hit Control P, which says make parent, and then we're going to say keep offset. So, oh, and I did these backwards. Let me just back it up. So Control Z, and let's do it differently. Let's do the hips, and then the bone, and then Control P, and then Control P, and there we go. So our bone, our root bone, became the parent of our hips, our spine, our left leg, and our right up leg. Now, we're going to also rename this bone. So to do so, you select the bone up here, and then you go to the Bone Details tab. And we're going to call this root. And again, the more you keep in line with the naming convention of the Unreal Engine, the easier it's going to be for it to auto-remap things for you. So cool. So we've got our root bone. And let's go back to pose mode and just play this back. So you can see from the center, there's this little point right here at the bottom, and his tail or whatever is kind of stretching out from there. And that indicates, hey, I started here and I moved my character some distance away from that point. Cool. Another thing you may notice is our animation here is set to 250 frames, and we're gonna have to change that to 62 because that's really the duration of our animation. So around 62 it finishes. So we're gonna change the end to 62. Keep that a little bit smaller. Cool. And now we can go ahead and start cleaning up our animation graph so this root definition actually works as expected. So we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to go to our animation graph, and to do so, you can flip either through this little gizmo or this little selection box in the bottom left-hand corner to your graph editor, or if you want to have multiple panes, you can grab any one of these edges, these little triangles, and just drag it over. And now I've got two windows. So I'm going to set my left one to be my graph, and my right one just to be my animation as I play it back. Okay, cool. So we've got that in place. Now let's go ahead and start looking at our bones. So we have a couple things going on here. We've got our hips, and you'll notice this stuff turns green, whereas the root stuff doesn't. And what that means is our root bone really doesn't have any keyframes. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click after we selected our root bone. We're going to right click on this transform section and say insert keyframes. And what that means is just right at the beginning we have our 0, 0 spot, and it doesn't really go from there. So let's replace the root bone keyframes with our hip keyframes. So if you select your hips on the left hand side here in the graph window, what we want to do is we want to grab the X, Y, and Z location of our hips, disregarding the scaling and the rotation elements of things. And to do that, you basically click, you're holding down Shift, these three sections, and then you go to Key, Copy Keyframes. You then go back to your root graph definition. And again, we're going to select these three using Shift. Then we go to Key and Paste Keyframes. So now, when we play this back, you'll notice this little pivot point bounces around as our character moves. Which is okay, but we don't want it to be... we don't want the root to be moving as well as the hips to be moving. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove these animations from our hips. So let's go to our hips, and I'm just going to click this global visibility link off. And we're going to make this screen just a little bit bigger. And then we're going to go through each one of these guys, and we're basically going to take them down to their very very beginning keyframe. So if we pick X, you'll notice, and I'm just zooming in with the middle mouse wheel, you'll notice we have these keyframes, and as we move around over them, we can see that the X location changes depending on the time. Cool, but we don't want this. We want to delete all of these keyframes except for the very first one. So to do so, what we're going to do is we're going to press B on our keyboard, and you can right click on each one of these nodes, or if you press B, you get these multi-selection tool, so you can highlight them all, and then hit delete, and it just deletes the keyframes. And keep working your way, hold down B, and highlight everything but the first one. So there we go, there's our keyframes gone for the X location. Cool. Let's do the same thing for the Y. So you can go ahead and kind of figure out, or you can do them all in one shot. There we go. And let's now do the Z. The Z is a little bit bigger. We've got a couple of these loose guys here. Okay, so we went ahead and we added the keyframes to our root bone. We removed them from our hips, and now when our character moves, you'll notice his root bone, which is almost vertical, 90-degree down, moves alongside our animation. And what that's going to mean is the center of the capsule is going to line up to this point, and it's going to fly around with these animations as expected. Cool. So, one more little thing we're going to do before we save this and import it back into Unreal. So, what we want to do is we are going to and I'm just trying to find the window for it. Oh, there we go. Sorry. So in our scene, we're going to go to our object details, and we're going to look for this section, mocap tools. And what mocap tools are is they come from plugin that can be turned off or on. If you go to File, User Preferences, and under Add-ons, if you go to Animation, you'll notice this section here, Animation Motion Capture Tools. So if you don't see this mocap tools section on your object details within your scene, make sure this plugin is turned on. When you do have it on, what we're going to do is we're going to hit this button here, Fix BVH Axes, and what it does is it course corrects the orientation of your character as it pertains to the animations. So if we hit that, you'll notice he kind of gets turned around in a weird rotation, almost like 90 degrees that way. And to correct it, on the transform, you'll notice there's already a 90-degree turn. Just set that to 0, and they're back up and normal. Cool. So we got our transform, our animations work, and then our root bone should go along with all this stuff. Cool. So let's now export our animation, FBX, and let's call this medium roundhouse root motion. And again, make sure your forward is set to -y and your up is set to Z. Export FBX. Cool. Let's go back to our project and now bring in this new animation. So there we go. When I drag in the animation, it automatically recognizes our root T-pose skeleton, which is what we were expecting. And then we've got the usual sort of options we can mess around with, as well as, that this came from Blender and it's 30 frames a second and all that stuff. Okay, so we'll import it. And there's our animation. Now you'll notice what we're seeing here is the character just kind of doing the exact same thing they were doing before. But if we now turn on this option, which is enable root motion, our character keeps moving forward. And here's what it looks like with the bone identifiers turned on. So you see there's our root, and as she moves a little bit forward and to the right, it drags out. But if we now go back to running root motion, she's moving. Okay. So we have this animation in place, and now we want to use it within our character. So how do we do that? Well, if we right-click on our animation and say Retarget Anim Assets, because we added that preview mesh earlier, we can now just go directly to our Unreal Mannequin. So there's our new animation, our root animation. So let's go to our kick folder. Oops. And we're just going to drag that in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this montage and we're going to duplicate it. And we're going to say root kick montage. And we're just going to get rid of a couple of these things. And not to freak anybody out, but I'm just going to turn off the bone hierarchy. So we're going to get rid of that. We're going to get rid of that. We're going to get rid of this section. We're going to get rid of this section. We're going to leave end 1. We'll get rid of end 3. That. Okay, and then we're going to just get rid of a couple of these notifications because we don't need all of them, just one. We're just going to work on this one kick animation. And that's fine. We're not really sure. Well, yeah, let's do it down here. That's when the sound is going to play. The collisions are always on because we're doing almost the full animation. And there's our medium roundhouse. Alright, so let's get rid of medium roundhouse and instead bring in medium roundhouse root. So this guy here. And then we're just going to realign these sections. So start is the first one. There's end. Okay, and all of that is in place. More or less. Where is that? It was around here somewhere. That, and these guys are on almost for the full duration. Okay, cool. So there's our single root kick montage. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to our data table and we're going to replace kick with this new montage. So we're going to say that, and it just has one. So now, and as you guys can see, because we have root motion enabled on that animation, our capsule and our player character moves along with it. Pretty cool. And all of our other stuff still works. Let me just get a little bit closer. Yeah, all of our kicks still work very nicely. But we also get this cool little movement of our capsule with our animation. So that's kind of it for root motion. And if you want to see just what this looks like, if we turn this back off, we can just go back to our animation, take off this checkbox, save, and there you can see the problem surfacing again. In fact, because the animation isn't accounting for sort of the offset when I was importing it, it's also kind of slides into the ground. So that can be simply adjusted by upping the various axis values when you're bringing in your animation. But let's turn this back on. Where did we go? There we go. Let's save that. And now we're back up and running. So the animation tries to stay within the capsule's definition, and everything moves together nicely. Our kicks still work. Our punches work as well. Excellent. So let's now see how we can do the exact same thing by turning this little kick animation into one that stays in place, so it doesn't move like these punches. Okay, so to do that, we're going to go back to Blender, and we're going to re-import our animation. Import FBX, and then let's go to our medium right roundhouse FBX file. And now, instead of worrying about anything to do with our root bone, what we're going to do is we're simply going to take away those translation details for our hips. So we know the hips are the root, and we know that when things move, that our character slides over a little bit on the on the X and the Y axes. So let's pop open. Let's pop open a secondary window, and let's look at our timeline. So let's go back to our armature section, down to our hips, and just make sure that our hip bones are selected. Cool. And let's get rid of all of these except for X, Y, and Z. So you'll notice as you slide your marker around these guys, this is where all that translation happens. And similar to what we did with our root motion, we can go ahead and simply delete these additional keyframes. So if I go ahead and, I select, let me just zoom in a bit on this. If I go ahead and I select all of these keyframes, and I just delete them, and then I go ahead and do the exact same thing to all of these guys, those are gone, then repeat the same exercise, except for the first one. You always want to leave the first keyframe in place, because it kind of determines the starting point of our animation. So, get rid of all those keyframes. Get rid of that guy. And then let's do our Z. Let's just try that again. There's our Z. And let's do this chunk up here. Cool. So there's our Z all cleaned up. And now, if we were to slide our timeline around, so let's make this a little bit bigger and then go back through our timeline definition, you'll notice the kick still occurs, but no one moves. The animation stays in place. So let's go ahead and tidy this guy up as well. So set the frame count to 62, because that's the duration of our animation. And then let's go back to our scene settings. Under the options, we're going to, again, fix the BVH axes, and then rotate it back up back to 0. And now we can export this out. So FBX, and we're going to call this the in place, or rather, medium roundhouse in place. And again, make sure your your forward is set correctly. Export FBX, and we're good. Let's go back to Unreal and now bring in this this new animation. So there's our in place, and let's bring it in. So you'll notice it tries to attach itself to the root T-pose skeleton, but if we try to import it, it actually freaks out. It doesn't like that. And it says, hey, you're trying to import an animation that is not targeted against a root motion or a root bones defined skeleton. So, figure that out. And we obviously can't import this animation. So how do we fix that? Well, our previous T-pose, our original character that we didn't modify, doesn't have a root bone. So we can use it as our basis for our other animation. So we bring that into Unreal. Again, let's disregard everything around animations, but let's just bring in this stuff. And skeleton should be, again, empty because we want it to be created by default when we bring in this character. So there's our other character, and there's its skeleton. So we're going to pop in the skeleton, go to the retargeting manager, and just to confirm, our skeleton tree, hips is still the root bone. So in our retarget manager, we want to pick humanoid rig, and then load the Mixamo rig again. And again, it's going to say hips and hips for the root and pelvis, which is what we're looking for. Save that, and just make sure you apply the default T-pose for our preview meshes. Cool. So let's now go ahead and bring in our in-place animation. So now it's going to say, well, what skeleton do you want to use? Well, we know that the root T-pose is no good. We know this guy's good, but he's not mapped yet. So let's bring it into this guy. And there we go. We got the same warning saying, hey, you have a bunch of hand items that are not mapped to anything on your mannequin. Let's disregard that. But there's our in-place animation. And, if we enable root motion, it's all messed up because she has no idea how to do root motion, anything. So let's take that off. Close this down, and then say retarget anim set. So now we're going to go from our in-place animation to our mannequin. Retarget, and there's our medium roundhouse in place. So we're going to bring this guy over to our kick as well. So there it is. We now have an in-place one. An in-place one as well as our root motion one. And let's do the same thing. So we're going to take this montage, we're going to duplicate it. In-place kick montage. Okay, there's our in-place kick montage, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this animation, toss it, and bring in our in-place one. Now, which one is it? This guy here. This guy here. No. Too far. There we go. And let's just readjust the start and the end. There's our end. And let's readjust this guy. It was right, I think around here is when we're starting to throw the sounds. Okay, so there's our in-place montage. Let's save that. Go back to our data table and now modify our kick to use our in-place kick montage. Save that and play. So now, when we throw a roundhouse, he doesn't go anywhere. And this is where we can get clever and adjust our actual, capsule movement to follow along whatever the animation is doing. Or we can just leave it as is. Now again, you'll notice the animation floats up because I haven't brought it down when I was importing it. You can check out those values as part of the Mixamo import video. But yeah, there you go, guys. So we have our in-place animations. We can very quickly flip them over to our root motion animations, which now move the whole capsule with our player. And then lastly, we can go back to our broken ass random kicks that kind of sort of do a little bit both. So there's in place, in place, in place. Oh, sorry. It's only doing one because I only said play back the first animation. There we go. There's our broken ass state. Cool. So, I hope this helps, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.